Hello DIYers, let's transform this vanity step by step. First, start your cleaning process with a vacuum. Then wash it with soap and water. After that, rinse it with a damp rag. Remove the nails to avoid stabbing yourself later on. Now take your Bondo wood filler and fill all of these holes. Then go back and fill anything you missed. Glue on loose veneer. Repair the track and remove that leaf decal. Grab a scraper to get the nail polish off. Try somehow to fix this side here. That didn't work, so I had to resort to chopping the back off. We're going to need to secure the top on with pocket holes. These tops were severely scratched. Someone once sanded against the grain, so we're going to use a few tricks to try to get them sanded smooth once again. Let's dive into all the tools and all the entire process from beginning to end of how we prepped these for sanding and painting. You'll learn how to solve many problems that come along with these DIY projects. Let's start with the hardest part of the entire flip. I tried to reuse what I had. Sometimes that's just easier and the most cost effective. However, in the end, it really just wasn't going to look as nice as I wanted it to, and it was way above my skill levels. I thought I could take and reuse an old drawer bottom for the side gap there. But all in all, it was going to be too many gaps, too many things to fill, and a little too unstable for what I really wanted this project to end up. So time to change the plan. I decided to remove the width of the biggest gap from the back of the nightstand. This way, the entire back would be uniform and I could put a new backer to the nightstands. Using my T-square, I drew a line so that I had a line for my circular saw to follow. And even though I'm using one of these straight edge guides, I like to have a double check, as you will. I've messed up so many times cutting things, and so I like to have a double check. I have a straight edge, but I also have the line drawn down where I want the cut to happen. This way I can make sure this irreplaceable top ends up the way that I want it to be. And now I've used the circular saw, went a little deeper on the side where I just removed the nail, and now I have an idea of where the cuts on the sides are going to be. These dresser legs are uneven, so to use the straight edge clamp, I put another board there to secure it in place. Using the circular saw again, I'm going to cut down the edge. This straight edge guide track was a little tricky to get used to, so I also drew a line where I wanted the guide track to be. And now that I'm done with that, we're moving on to sawing off the bits of chunks that are sticking out from where the old back used to be. I also ended up using a planer to scrape the back of those off as well. Smoothing everything out on the back with 80 grit sandpaper, but being really careful around the edges where there's veneer, because you can end up chipping the veneer off and having to fill those later. For the edges around the veneer, I used 180 grit, being careful not to push up the veneer. My circular saw must have flinched there. I have a little divot that I'm going to fix using 60 grit sandpaper to smooth it out. Here's a little shot of the before and now the after, which I think is a huge improvement and it makes me much happier. What do you think? Would you have gone this extreme and cut off the entire back? This is a pocket hole maker by Quick Jig. It's listed below, but I'll be using this to secure the top again to the base. There's two sections you can use to make pocket holes, so this top view shows where the line is that you need to make sure is in the center of the board. There's also a setting on the kit where you can adjust where that round piece is around the drill bit. That's how far you need to drill into the piece to make the pocket hole. Also lines on the side that will tell you where to line it up depending on how thick the wood is that you're drilling into. Here's the guide that you'll use that comes with every kit, telling you where to set the slide and the size screw that you'll need and the width of the wood that all come into play when you are using this pocket hole maker. The top started lifting up, so I had to grab a clamp and clamp it all down so there will be pressure against the screw trying to go into the wood top. Continue this process on each of the backs of the nightstands. Now that it's secured, you're going to cut a new back. This is some beadboard that I had lying around as scrap, but the back of it is smooth and blank. It's a very thin plywood, like about 1/8 of an inch, I would say. I'm just going to use that. So we are reducing and reusing. To secure the new back, grab your brad nailer and go all the way around the rectangle. Now we get to glue on all that loose veneer and fill in all the sides. I fell in love with this blunt needle application method. You get so far up into this veneer and you don't have to lift it up with a spatula. It's so much. Now we're going to remove any nails so that we don't stab ourselves later on. Usually I would try to hammer these out the other direction and just take them out with the claw of a hammer. On this piece though, they hit the construction piece inside. There's no way you could hit them out without removing a piece of the drawer shelf itself. So we're just going to use a multi-purpose tool and go at an angle, try to cut as far back as you can, and we'll fill those in later with Bondo so you won't see them at all or have to worry about the metal sticking out. Now we can fill those cracks with Bondo wood filler. 2 parts, hardens in 15 minutes, so it's a really good choice if you're trying to flip this quickly. You can sand it with 80 grit after you're done. I missed some pieces here and I had to go back and refill any divots. And I'll resand with 80 grit as soon as this is dry in 15 minutes. It says on the back of the can to wear a respirator while you use Bondo. We are also going to wear a respirator while we sand the Bondo, but adding a vacuum, you can see here in a second that it works so well at collecting all of the dust and preventing it from going into your lungs and all over your shop. Now when you're sanding, you want to make sure that you're placing the sander on the surface first and then turning the sander on. Here I have no vacuum on and dust is flying everywhere all over the shop, and now once you finally turn your vacuum on, you can see that it starts to collect the dust and you have less of a mess. It doesn't end up in your lungs and it's a lot healthier for you. After your spaces have been filled and you've sanded with 80 grit, it's time to work our way back up the sanding chain. You can go from 80 to 120 to 180, which will make it a paintable surface. I know it's not paintable or not stainable, so you will have to paint it. Everyone's favorite task, sanding forever. I'm also going to talk about Durham's wood putty. Here I'm demonstrating going up the sanding grit, and don't forget to wipe your surface between sanding. You don't want any of those chunks from the 80 grit sandpaper stuck on the table because it'll just swirl in your surface and create 80 grit damage. The whole point of moving up in grits is to prevent any curlicues or swirl marks in your finish so that when you go to paint, all those things will show up. So this is something that happened to me for the first time. This is oak. This is oak veneer, and the surface is pitted in between the wood grain. So I'm going to try Durham's wood putty to fill in those little gaps. Sets quickly. So we're going to want to work kind of fast. I'm just going to eyeball it. Thin out pretty good. You see, you don't need as much water. See how soupy it is? So, oopsies. I like to show you how you can fix mistakes. This is pretty easy. You're just going to add putty. Next time I read up on it, it is 3 parts putty to 1 part water, and you'll get that thicker consistency. So here I am just skimming the top, pushing it into the wood grain, and then I'll let it. Now we're going to stand with 180 grit because that's what we ended on before we put the wood putty down. Keep in mind with this wood putty, with it having water in it, it'll raise the wood grain. So you're really coming up with a really nice finish through this whole process. This type of wood putty needs to be sealed with a clear coat before you paint it. I'm just using a clear coat Rust-Oleum matte finish. It says on the can before you recoat it to let it dry for a few hours, and then you can sand it to 180 because that is what we want our paint to go on, is a 180 grit finish. Moving on to removing that decal on the top of the grapes and the leaves, just using a hammer and a flathead screwdriver, the right angle, and a little bit of patience. And then we'll go in and use the Durham's wood putty. And I'm going to use 40 grit, sanding by hand with this very stiff foam block. You can use a 2x4 chunk also. And remember to go with the grain, or you'll regret it. I filled in these cracks with more Durham's water putty after it was smoothed out with the 40 grit. It's okay to have to go back over a second time. Once it's dried, you'll see any other spots you need to put more water putty on. So here I am just taking a damp sponge and smoothing out any of the surfaces. Some people said it's kind of hard to sand the water putty after it's dry, so this can help with the sanding process afterwards. I didn't see any swirl marks, and I had filled it in with a water putty, so I'm going to go back and sand with 180 grit. So even though I jumped from 40 to 180, it should still be okay. And then go ahead and seal that with clear coat also. Moving on to the drawers. In the beginning, you take out every drawer and you label it so that you know where it goes back into. These older style dressers and desks go in a specific spot usually. One of the drawer slides need to be re-glued. It's a very easy fix. We're just going to lift up the drawer slide with our hammer, pop it open and put some glue in there. Then we'll nail it back in place. This is definitely one of the easier fixes, just being able to glue it down and not dealing with anything that's broken. I sanded all the drawers with 180 grit to be ready for paint. And there you can see that I need to fix some damages in the corner and on the top of this drawer here. Filled it in with Bondo and then let it dry for about 10 minutes. And before it's fully cured, you can reshape it with a knife. This will help you save on sandpaper and can also help you reshape corners. So you can use this process on corners as well. Wiping all the drawers off after I sanded. Those knobs were just held on by 2 screws, no glue was involved. Now that we've dealt with the damage, we can move on to sanding the rest of the body. The curved edge, if you use an 80 grit, you can end up reshaping the entire surface. So 180 grit is nice to just use if you're trying to take off the initial veneer for the paint to stick to. You're really just wanting to scuff up the surface to give the paint something to stick through. This part was extremely intimidating. I had no idea if I was going to get these scratches out of here. I started with a carbide scraper to get the initial layer of finish off. As you can see, those are pretty deep scratches, probably done with 180 grit against the grain, probably hand sanded. That's my best guess. So I've seen a few hacks on TikTok or wherever of using steam, which I wish I would have done first, but I tried with 40 grit a few times, and since it's oak veneer, it was really difficult to sand. So now we're moving on to the iron, spraying the surface. Next time, use a towel. I don't know what I was thinking here. You can also use this process to remove veneer. So less is more. Don't overdo it. Let it sit. It was super hot out, so I put it outside to dry in the sun and let it dry fully before I sanded anything. After drying, I started with 60 grit and then 80 grit. And then I moved on to, since the scratches were so bad and the veneer did seem pretty thick enough, like I had a lot to work with, I went with 80 grit twice in a row. To really avoid any curlicues, I only stepped up to 100 instead of 120. Typically, you can go from 80 to 120. Sanding takes so long. This is super sped up. But now we're going on to 120, and then we'll move on to 180 because that's what I had. And it's okay to jump from 120 to 180. And lastly, I went to 240 only because the veneer was really pitted again, and I wanted it to be sealed and nice. But once you actually sand up to a 240, you're really polishing the surface, so it's not going to accept the stain well. And after I used another carbide scraper, a detailed carbide scraper to scrape the edges, and then I went back with 180, on the sides to clean it all up. I couldn't be happier that I got all of the scratches out, and it looks great in my opinion. So on the right is the before and left is the after. Here are the finished pieces. Now they're going to their new home where the person wants to paint and stain them themselves. To recap, we ended up with 180 on the sides, 240 on the top. Time to find another piece to flip.